Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to rise in the House today and speak to this motion 502 that calls on the government to consider the advisability of measures to strengthen and deepen the vessel navigation channel that provides access from Georgian Bay to the westerly limit of the Trent Severn waterway at Port Severn. What the motion is attempting to address, Mr. Speaker, is in fact a bit of a hazardous part of the trip through the 386-kilometer waterway. The channel that these boats are having to go through is rock-faced, quite narrow, and subject to swift currents from the operation of the locks and also from winds, Mr. Speaker, and the boats that travel through that narrow channel often get shifted around by both the currents and winds into rock faces and experience problems. I'm very pleased to speak to the motion for a couple of reasons, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, I spent 3 happy summers on the Trent Severn waterway as a summer student, and indeed another year on the Rideau Canal again as a summer student. These were great jobs, and students frankly couldn't ask for better work. It was outside, it was well paid, and that work went a long way in helping me through those years of university. Now, I have to acknowledge I wasn't lock staff, Mr. Speaker. I was an interpretive guide, and on the Trent Severn I spent most of my time in Peterborough at the lift lock, the highest lift lock in the world, as of course we all in the House know, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker. But I did, of course, get the opportunity to see the full length of the waterway, sometimes dressed as Boomer the Beaver, sometimes just in my Parks Canada uniform.
Amazing.
It was amazing. I got to see the Kirkfield lift lock too, Mr. Speaker, which was it's the second highest lift lock in the world. Who knew? As well as the Marine Railway up at Big Chute, but engineering marvels top to bottom on the Trent Severn. And my time on the Rideau similarly was spent as an interpretive guide and split between the blockhouse at Kingston Mills and the blacksmith shop up at Jones Falls, where by the end of the summer I became pretty handy at bashing out a few standard household items over the forge. Now, neither of these jobs had the cool factor of lock staff, of course, Mr. Speaker. That goes without saying, since I had to dress as Boomer the Beaver from time to time and run around in militia uniform firing off muskets in the dark. But they did afford me the opportunity as a young person to get some insight into the history of this country and indeed into the history of the First Nations and how they lived on these lands and used the natural waterways before these canals and waterways were actually linked. And there are a couple of lessons in all of this that stand out for me, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, we have before us a motion that's a relatively modest one. I think the member has priced it at $600,000 and change. And, of course, given the numbers we deal with in this House, Mr. Speaker, that strikes us as relatively small. But what I want to talk about is the issue of ambition, and this is why I support even this smaller proposal in this motion. The ambition required of nation builders, and the ambition that we, Canada, once had to build the infrastructure that makes a nation. And these waterways, Mr. Speaker, were carved out of some very hard and difficult and unforgiving land, and they remain marvels, national historic sites, both the Rideau and the Trent Severn, and of course the Rideau has the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation as well. And they remain, among other things, marvels of engineering. The lift locks along the Trent Severn still captivate and perplex, frankly. People are so simple, and yet people stand at the bottom wondering, how do these things work? How did they build that? And the waterways are but two examples, outstanding ones albeit, of an infrastructure that built this country. Laying railroad track across this country, across beautiful but hostile territory, through equally difficult and often deadly summers and winters was no less a feat, of course. And it's not just about rural and remote infrastructure that built this country. It's also about urban infrastructure. In Toronto, one need only look at the Bloor Street Viaduct built almost 100 years ago. It was designed to facilitate mass transit, Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the 20th century, long before we needed mass transit. Its upper deck was built to accommodate streetcars, while the lower deck was built for rail transportation. Controversial at the time because of the high additional costs, but the bridge's designer and the Commissioner of Public Works for Toronto at the time, R.C. Harris, were able to have their way. And the lower deck on that Bloor Street Viaduct proved to save millions upon millions of dollars when the TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, ultimately opened the Bloor-Danforth subway almost half a century later. And they were able to use that bridge with no major structural changes. And just down the road from my home in Toronto, and ever so slightly outside my riding, unfortunately, because I'd like to call it my own, is the R.C. Harris water filtration plant. And it tells a similar story. Early in the 20th century, Toronto was plagued with water shortages and unclean drinking water. So a plant was built in the 1930s to purify water, and that's the R.C. water filtration plant, and it still functions today, Mr. Speaker, providing almost half the water to Toronto and York region all these years later. And it's interesting that Michael Ondaatje's novel In the Skin of a Lion tells the story of how in the 1930s water intakes were built more than 2.5 kilometers out under the lake offshore in 15 meters of water and connected to the plant through pipes running under the bed of the lake. And these were the kinds of ambition that we had, Mr. Speaker, at one time to build the infrastructure upon which we built great cities and a great country. And it is forward-looking, it is courageous, and it understands that infrastructure needs to be built now to serve as the foundation for a prosperous future. We are falling short on this, Mr. Speaker. I talk all the time in this House about the impact of this lack of ambition of successive federal governments on our cities. But here, let me restrict my comments to our waterways. Recent estimates suggest that Parks Canada is letting our cultural, economic, and environmental assets go. Recent reports, Mr. Speaker, on Parks Canada and its assets suggest that there's been poor stewardship of its vast holdings, estimated in 2012 to require some $2.9 billion in deferred repairs. Deferred work on the Trent Severn Waterway alone is estimated to be almost $700 million. And a recent letter made public by retired managers of both the Trent Severn and the Rideau Canal point to many problems emerging out of the cuts made in the 2012 budget. Some of those cuts have been restored, Mr. Speaker, but they've left a devastating impact on these two canals. And the managers, they speak to the natural and cultural resources of the two waterways. They speak to all the complexity of uses of these waterways and the complexity of the watershed that the waterways run through, all the recreational uses, and they challenge the government to ask themselves, thank you, Mr. Speaker, whether they're really paying attention and respecting the heritage that we have here. The second point, Mr. Speaker, just to conclude, is a more modern one. And this letter points to this issue, that these waterways are not remote anymore. They serve many functions and many people and fall under the jurisdiction of more than one government. That's to say that management is always a complex issue, and many important interests need to be served. The cuts to the hours of operation of these canals that flowed from the 2012 budget have had a devastating impact, Mr. Speaker. The rolling crews through these locks, as someone who worked on the waterway at one point in time, I know is devastating to the economies along the waterway. And I think that one thing I'd like to see coming out of this motion, Mr. Speaker, to support this motion is greater consultation with all the competing but many complementary interests that exist along the waterway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Ottawa South.